program we have today is one that was suggested by our colleagues, and it's one that I had seen, at least in part, several years ago. I thought it was very, very informational and very important when later on, when you never expected anything would ever go wrong, something did go wrong. I went back and picked up on the points that Carl Christoph had made in his workshop, and I found them to be very practical and very helpful. And when we talked about it again with the advisory committee, they said let's give it another shot. You see so often that thing that happens that you never expected, and the longer you're in it, the more likely it is that something will happen. And how you handle the crisis, how you prepare for it, will speak volumes of your leadership capabilities, and we'll have some better knowledge of how to do that after the workshop. Hodgson Russ, probably the premier law firm in Western New York. They have been sponsors with us for many years. They have a great team of attorneys. Carl Christoph will be talking to us today. He is one of the really outstanding educational attorneys, and he's being joined by Jeff Switek, who I've had a chance to work with on a number of occasions. He is equally an outstanding educational attorney. So with that, I will turn it over to Carl, and we'll see what to do about something we hope never happens.
And what we're going to try and do this morning is talk a little bit in terms of the things that will help the media get it right. So this is about media relations training. Crises, as Bob mentioned, happen. Just think about the headlines you've read in the paper over the past year or so. Bus accidents, teachers who are accused of molesting youngsters. I mean, and the list sort of goes on. Those things happen. Bob's right. Jeff and I have been doing this long enough to have been involved in many crises. And it's absolutely imperative, we're going to suggest, that you come at that crisis with some kind of plan in mind. Even if it's just about teaching people to use periods. Say what you have to say, don't say more than you have to say. There's the old saw about, when someone asks you what time it is, don't tell them how to make a clock. That's true in media relations as well. So this is about getting your story out. One of the best tools that anyone dealing with the media can have is what is commonly known as a SOCO, the Supreme Overriding Communications Objective. That's the first thing I would suggest needs to be planned as far as dealing with the media in any sort of crisis. So what goes into developing a SOCO? Well, the first thing, of course, is you need to know your objective. What are you trying to communicate? What's the most important thing that someone listening to you or reading about you in the newspaper has to take away with respect to the crisis? What's the objective? Why are you granting that interview? The key facts, the statistics that you want to communicate. It's very, very important to have as much information as you can, recognizing, incidentally, that most leaders in these kinds of situations perhaps have only 75% of the information that they actually need, but nonetheless are on the spot and are going to have to respond. You obviously need to identify your audience. Do you want to communicate to your staff, to the students, to the public at large, to all of them at once? Depending on the nature of the crisis, that can vary. For example, if you have a cyber breach, the first thing you want to do is to communicate to the folks whose data may have been compromised. Everyone else is almost secondary. So that crisis is handled a little bit differently than if you have a highly public event, where the profile is already high, and the press is waiting for you as you walk into the office in the morning. Of course, you try and make the message as simple as possible. and give the press the one takeaway that you want them to have. In an interview situation, in planning for an interview, you need to think of the components of your story and how deep you want to get into these components. So the first one, of course, are the conclusions. Okay? What is the takeaway? What is your preliminary conclusion? Are the children safe? The findings. What is that 75% of the information that you have? What constitutes that? The findings. The validations. You not only have the findings, but then there's the proof behind the findings. What did you do to reach those findings? The methods. How did you go about that? And finally, the general background information. My suggestion, stay as near to the top of that list as you can when you're dealing with the media. If you can stay with the conclusions, with your takeaways, that's the best of all worlds. If you get on down to starting to talk about your methods and background information, let me suggest that you can be in trouble. So, here's an example of a psycho following an anthrax threat. The safety of the children was our first priority. The children are safe. We are doing everything we can to protect them in this situation. And oh, by the way, there has not been a single valid biohazard in the United States resulting from terrorism in the last 30 years. Not a bad sacco, right, in that situation? Okay, here are 3 other examples. A couple of them are video, one of them I'm going to tell you about. So let's see how the technology works.
You've said that if Congress doesn't have a deadline, things don't get done in this town. But Democrats like Kent Conrad are also saying, quote, sometimes when you move too quickly, you make mistakes. So is this really something you want to dig in your heels on? I mean, is there any flexibility on this August deadline?
Well, I want to keep the pressure on because we're making steady progress. People are working hard. I just met with these House Democrats, and they were in there for 3 hours. I could only join them for an hour. I understand that the Senate Finance Committee is meeting 3 times today. That kind of work is going to produce good results. Here's what I won't do. I will, as I said before, I won't sign a bill that I think does not reduce costs, does not keep deficit neutral, and does not benefit middle-class families in America. So I want to put the pressure on, but ultimately the test is this a bill that I think is going to be better for the American people or not?
So again, crisis, these folks are planning for the crisis. The CEO is talking to his public information officer.
Well, it's probably too cold up there for that right now. As of last night, there are 5 deaths and 32 cases.
There's a cluster in an elementary school.
Okay, that's the kind of thing you're going to have to be prepared for. It's going to be all over the news big time. What's your single overriding communications objective?
We're isolating the sick and quarantining those who we believe were exposed.
Sometimes a sacco doesn't always have to be serious, even in a serious situation. Bob Howard, some years back, was the public information officer for the Centers for Disease Control. And there was a very serious flu epidemic in the country. And he inveigled an invitation to be on Johnny Carson's show because he knew that there was a wide audience with which he could communicate in that fashion. So when he got there and they were in the green room, he actually asked Carson to ask him, what's the one thing that we can tell people to do to avoid getting infected by this flu? And sure enough, they went out, the program started, Howard was introduced, and Carson led right off with the question. Howard's response was this: if it's wet and it's not yours, don't touch it. the Saco. Okay, so there are some understandings that are needed at the outset, and with that, I'm going to lateral over to Jeff.
Good morning, everybody. One takeoff on what Carla mentioned, particularly the interaction between Katie Couric and Barack Obama. I think it demonstrated Barack Obama's skill in terms of making that pivot, which, the first principle of which is to at least acknowledge the question. Another example of that I think illustrates the contrast occurred, probably the best example of this I ever saw, occurred during the vice presidential debate between Joe Biden and Sarah Palin. And Sarah Palin, who had been the governor of Alaska, of course, was asked a question about a scandal that was just reported, just broke in the Alaskan papers, I think 1 or 2 days before the debate. So the question was, Governor Palin, can you please comment on the scandal that just was reported in the Alaskan Gazette or whatever it was? And her immediate response was, I'd be happy to talk about John McCain's tax reduction plan. There was no acknowledgement even of the question. She went immediately into the Saco, but didn't acknowledge the question and exercise that kind of skill and depth in terms of then pivoting. So it really is something to work on. It is a skill. The media is savvy enough. They know, like Katie Couric did, what's happening. But it's much harder for them to object and much harder for them to get really overly agitated about it if you at least acknowledge the question and then you make that skillful pivot over to what you want to talk about, the playing field that you want to be playing on. And that's really, to my mind, really the important part of the Saco is at least acknowledging the question and then making that pivot in a skillful way. So Benjamin Cardozo, one of the most famous jurists in this case that's up here, said inaction without more is not tantamount to choice. That's certainly the case when it comes to legal obligations and legal responsibilities. Of course, it's not the case when you're dealing with the media, because inaction is very much a choice. If you choose not to engage with the media, if you choose to simply say no comment to the media, they're still going to write a story anyway, but your story is not going to be a part of it. So that's one of the most important things, I think, in terms of dealing with the media. They will not go away during a crisis, and learning to deal with them effectively is an absolute imperative for anybody in a leadership position, particularly when you're in the public sector, where the public expects that you're going to be sharing information, you're going to be transparent and so forth, all the principles that we're used to dealing with both internally as well as externally. Carol and I put together these next several slides as much from our perspectives as attorneys who have been able to work with school districts for more years now than I think we can cumulatively count. But also, Carl had long service in the U.S. military. I was on the town board here in Cheektowaga for 16 years, so we've seen it on both ends, both as counselors and advisors to folks like you that we've been fortunate enough to work with over the years, as well as on the other side of it when we're the ones that the questions are directed to. And we wanted to come up with a listing of some of the best practices or some of the first principles in terms of what works the best in most cases in terms of dealing with the media. There's no one size fits all. But there certainly are some recurring rules and best practices that we've picked up along the way, and that's what we wanted to really share with you during this part of the presentation. One of the first issues is the issue of the personal relationship or not that you may have with the media. And my experience has been working with the press at all levels. I was down in D.C. for several years on Capitol Hill, working with the kind of people that you see on TV. I've worked with local newspapers here and everything in between. And I think one principle that I've seen consistent throughout, regardless of what the nature is of the media and what level of media you're working with, is that some reporters are good people. Some reporters you will like personally. Some reporters perhaps not as much. But the one thing I've seen is that reporters, no matter how close or not you are with them, they love their jobs. They love the concept of a free media. They love the principle that the public has a right to know more than they like you. So although having a good, professional, courteous relationship and respectful relationship with the media can very much pay dividends on the margins, you can't rely upon that to avoid a story being reported in a way that they want to report it as opposed to the way that you wish to have it reported. So I think by all means, treat the media the way you would any other professional colleague or any other professional interaction you would have, which is respectful, professional, but don't get too comfortable. Maintain that professional distance and that wall ultimately between the job that they have to do and the job that you're obligated to do on behalf of your school district. They, of course, have agendas. Their agenda basically, in the first instance, is to write a story. And again, they're going to write that story whether you're a participant in that or not. Instead of looking at that as a challenge, instead of looking at that as an annoyance or an irritant, look at that as an opportunity to tell your side of the story, to try to form that story in the way that you think is most effective and most accurate. And that again is something that is useful when you have that SACO, when you have that plan right from the start. You can help to direct the reporter who, you've been living the story most likely. You're directly involved in it. It may be a story that you've been working on, without perhaps any public awareness for a while. The issue may have arisen, internally, whatever the case may be, or it may be thrust on you, in a moment's notice. Even though that may be the dominant issue in your life in terms of, the attention that you're spending dealing with it, the reporter likely has another 10 or 15 stories going on at the same time. They're not an expert in education. They're not an expert in all the things that you're expert in and the things that you deal with and are responsible for on the part of your school district. They have other things to do, other priorities, and other things that demand their attention. So use that to help them fill in the gaps of their knowledge as appropriate. So again, the story has the best chance of being a story that's accurate and that serves your purposes, as opposed to the story that serves their purposes, where it's filled in by others who don't have the same knowledge, the same perspective, and the same responsibilities that you have. The comment of no comment or not responding, or I'm sorry, I can't say anything about that, that's really something that represents a lost opportunity. Not only will it annoy the reporter, most likely, not only will the public, when it's reported that you said no comment, it will make the public think that you have something to hide, or that what's being written about you in fact is true, because otherwise why wouldn't you be commenting about it? So not only does it put you in I think, a very, very difficult position to begin with, but again, it's a missed opportunity to tell your side of the story. Now, of course, there are situations, particularly when you're dealing in the public school context, where you simply can't share information. There's certain categories of information. We have a slide later on that recounts some of the general categories, but things like student information, student identifiable information. The federal FERPA law makes it illegal for you to share certain identifying details, even if you wanted to. And even if some of those details are already out there in the public realm and the reporter is aware of them and intends to report on them, you still have to live by your responsibilities as a school district official to not violate the confidentiality and the privacy rights that students have under the FERPA law. So there are, particularly in the public context, there are more restraints than you necessarily deal with in the private sector, for instance, that you have to be mindful of. But by the same token, you can still talk in generalities in a way that reflects your SACO. So even though there may be a student incident that may arise, the media may become aware, for instance, of an altercation that took place in the school, may even be aware of some of the identifying details. Your response can be that, I'm sorry, I can't comment on any individual situations involving students. Be careful not to even acknowledge, that this situation occurred, because that indirectly is confirming student identifiable information. But say I can't comment on whether or not an incident between students occurred. What I can tell you is that our primary commitment here is to ensure student safety, and that if any incident does occur, we're going to respond to it immediately, we're going to respond to it effectively, and we're going to ensure that this is a safe environment for student learning. That's saying a lot without really saying anything at all. And that's the proper balance in a situation like that when you're dealing with the types of legal restraints and legal restrictions that apply to you with regard particularly to students. And again, today, particularly with Facebook, with Twitter, with cell phones with cameras on them, you don't have the luxury any longer of being able to have a 24-hour news cycle between the time an incident starts and the media first starts talking to you and the time that it ultimately makes its way into the newspapers or magazines or whatever the case may be in the old media days. These days you have to be prepared to immediately get your story out, get your word out in the way that reflects not only your legal obligations, but reflects your SACO, that again attempts to guide and push the story in the direction that you believe is the most effective. As I think Carl already had at least made reference to, don't volunteer unnecessary information. Don't feel obligated to fill in the silence that may be on the other end of the phone, no matter how long that uncomfortable silence may occur. We have a technique when we're interviewing and cross-examining witnesses to ask the same question sometimes 2 or 3 times to see whether or not you may get a different answer. To try to get the witnesses talking. At the very least, you don't learn anything new. At the very best, you learn something that's very valuable that may help to advance your case. Reporters use the exact same technique. They want to get you talking as much as they possibly can. They'll ask the same questions over and over to try to see whether or not you give them a little bit different information or a little variance in the information you're giving them. They're very trained at that and very used to doing that. Don't feel obligated to play along. Establish your plan, establish your SACO, and then tell them what you're going to tell them, what you're willing to tell them, and that simply has to be good enough. And if you have to, if you have to tell them that at some point, Tell them that at some point. But don't let them drive your agenda. You have your own agenda, and the more disciplined you are about that, the more effective ultimately the story is going to be. Again, try to answer only the question that's asked. Don't try to help them necessarily by leading them or anticipating their next question, except to the extent that you're transitioning into your SACO. And that should be something you come back to once, twice, 3 times if necessary. Don't think that they're going to understand and perceive immediately that what you told them once was your SACO. Don't think that they're going to pick up on that necessarily. If you need to get back to it, repeat it, reinforce it, do that, but be consistent about it. So that, again, there's no variance in terms of the information that you're providing to them. It's really, it's something that, again, you're living this, you've thought about what you want to say, you've thought about the central theme that you want to try to convey and communicate to the media. But again, they're not familiar with the subject matter necessarily. They got a lot of other things going on. You got to help to spoon feed them to the right results so they understand what you're trying to say. But make sure what you're trying to say is what you're saying consistently. And don't engage in a debate. Many times reporters will, in some cases, reveal their biases or reveal their inclinations or their predeterminations about a story by engaging in a debate. Well, isn't this true? But how can you say that if this happened? Or that really doesn't make sense to me. Well, that's too bad if they don't like it. It's too bad if they don't think that it's the answer they should be getting. The point is that is your response. That is our position. That is what we do here in the district. That is how we handle student safety. That is how we handle employee relations. That is how we handle issues with visitors to school property. And again, don't rise to the bait. Don't rise to the bait that they're going to sometimes set for you. In some cases, they do that strategically. I do know reporters that do try to antagonize. They do try to debate. They do try to confront because they think that that's the way to get you talking. Because again, if at worst, they're not going to learn anything new. At best, they get you to rise to the bait. They get you agitated. They get you frustrated, and they may actually get you to say something that you didn't want to say, but you did because in a moment's lapse of anger or anxiety or frustration in terms of them confronting you, you let something slip. So don't fall to that bait, and again, remain disciplined from the start to the finish. And don't try to place blame when communicating information. It's very easy, and in many cases appropriate and accurate, for instance, to point the finger at SED or point the finger at the state legislature. You can do so in a factual way without making it look like you're trying to duck responsibility, you're trying to complain, you're trying to basically act as though, we're helpless here, what can we do, it's their fault. You can get that message across, but you can do so in an accurate way, a factual way, without necessarily coming across as being unwilling to accept responsibility. Most importantly, don't distort the truth. If you have to say no comment, if you have to say I'm sorry, I can't comment on this, but that's fine. But don't feel as though you need to provide information, and particularly don't distort the truth inadvertently because you didn't know the full story at the time you were answering the question. This is something that pertains just as much in terms of interacting with the media as it does as responding to the public at board meetings. There's a great power in the power of referral. I'm sorry, I really would like to get a better sense of the background of the question that you just presented to me. I don't know the full background, I'll be honest about that, but I can promise you that we're going to look at it and I'll get back to you within 24 hours, so I'll get back to you next week, or I'll get back to you whenever. There's a great power in doing that to ensure that when you do respond, whether it's to a parent, to the media, whatever the case may be, you're able to respond on an informed basis, and because it was informed and you had a complete understanding of the facts, you were able to then determine the most accurate and effective SACO. Now, sometimes you don't have that luxury, particularly when there's an immediate crisis that occurs. You have to roll along. In that case, you have to make sure that the information you're providing and the statements you're making are properly conditioned on the fact, from what I know today, here's what I believe occurred, or here's what we're doing. Make sure, though, that there's a clear understanding that is as we sit here today, and that you're reserving your right, obviously, to modify that or correct that as you go forward and new information becomes available. If you are in the context of a press conference, which doesn't happen all that often, but sometimes it's necessary and sometimes it's desirable, particularly with something that's happening quickly, unfolding quickly, or if it's an issue that really has engendered vast media attention. Suppose the one newspaper reporter calling you, you're getting calls from channels 2, 4, and 7, from CNN, from the Buffalo News, from the local papers. If you do decide it's appropriate to have a more traditional press conference, have only one person at the podium. Have only the designated spokesperson for the district at the podium. One thing the press loves to do is they love to talk to as many people as they possibly can, and if you make it easy for them to line up all the district officials at the podium, you can be certain that there's going to be questions directed to everybody, because they're going to want to see whether or not there's a consistent message, and if they can find one variance between school district representatives or officials, that's going to be the story. It's not going to be the SACO, it's going to be the school district doesn't know what it's doing, or not everybody in the school district agrees with the school district's perspective or the school district's response or the facts that that have arisen in the circumstance. That's the case obviously not only with regard to a press conference, but also just in terms of any media contacts. And make sure that if you are going to permit other people in the district, other administrators, board members, whatever the case may be, to interact with the media, make sure there's consistency of information. They're going to want to ask as many people questions as they can. It's a principle that we talk about a lot when we're preparing for arbitrations, preparing for conferences of the Public Employment Relations Board. Whoever you bring with you, you have to be prepared that the judge is going to ask questions, that the arbitrator is going to ask questions to, that the other side is going to present questions to. So if you are going to make people available to the media, more than just one single designated spokesperson for any particular issue, make sure that there's not only the plan and the SACO in place, but there's going to be consistency. Everybody's on the same page, and there's an awareness and an expectation as to what that message is and how you're going to deal with it. And I touched upon this principle already, but again, gather all the facts and don't answer the questions before you know the answers, unless you have to, and in that case, make sure you're conditioning it on as we know today, or as of today, here's what we believe may have happened. The issue of a press conference is not always ideal. One of the problems, of course, is that you only get one shot then. You've then talked to all the media, you've said what you've said. If you made a mistake, if something didn't quite come out the way you wanted it to, you don't really get necessarily an easy second chance. Whereas if you're dealing with multiple medias in a series of interviews, you get better at it, frankly. And if you do slip up, if there is a mistake made with one media outlet, at least you can correct it with others, and hopefully that will then carry the day as subsequent reports and stories come out. Right.
Are there any circumstances where a press release or written statement might be a good strategy to preempt?
Yeah, I think there's two reasons why putting something down in writing can be very useful. One is simply to ensure that you've thought through. I think there's a good exercise in terms of putting down in writing what your thoughts are, what you believe your SACO is, what message you want to communicate. It's good, I think, for you, even if you as the superintendent, board member, administrator, whatever the case is, even if you're the single designated spokesperson, I think there's a value in the exercise of translating what's in your mind to paper, to see what it looks like, to see what it's going to read like when it appears in print, for instance. I think that's a useful exercise. It's also then obviously easier to share that with others in the district. If the plan is to allow the press to have access to multiple district representatives, it's much easier to keep everybody on the same page if they have the same script, so to speak, or the same talking points, so to speak, or the same SACO description, so to speak. And then finally, you can use that in the form of a submitted press release. I can tell you, at least in my experience, and I'm sure many of you have the same experience, the press typically doesn't like just accepting something in writing from you without asking follow-up questions. In fact, I've never seen an instance. I frequently have put together written press releases. I haven't seen a single instance that I can recall where the reporter said, okay, thank you very much, and they walked away. They'll take it, it'll be a resource and something that they can reference later on when they're actually writing their story, but they're still going to want to follow up and ask you questions, interact with you, because they know you thought about what you put in the press release. What they want to know is what you're really thinking, and they're more likely to elicit that if they interact with you and if they use some of the tools and some of the strategies that they use. They have meetings like this as well from the other direction. How do you get people talking? How do you get public officials talking? How do you make sure that you're getting the accurate information from them, not just the thing that they've canned that they want to feed to us as a media? So the written press statements, press releases can be useful. The one other variation of that is sometimes it's necessary to have a press release when you are dealing with a story that's rapidly developing. When things are unfolding very quickly, when you feel the need to get the word out immediately for whatever reason, in terms of what the district is doing or what the district's response is or what the district's position is, sometimes necessarily you have to rely, at least initially, on a written press release to get that out in a comprehensive way. You can then follow up perhaps with individual interactions with the press. But there may be some instances where you just simply have to get something out in writing right away to make sure that the proper messaging is getting out immediately to everybody.
Yeah, great point. I was going to mention that, and that it's also gives you the ability to regroup and start thinking about good
So you get your little breather and say, I've already released a press release, and that's all I'm going to speak about at this point. And then gives you 24 hours or maybe an hour.
Right. So in other words, you've served the appetizer. That should keep them satisfied for a while. You can regroup and then get on to the main course at some point. It's a great point. Let's move on here. One area that is often misunderstood is, what does it mean when you're talking to a reporter off the record? Or what does it mean when you're talking to a reporter on background? And how do you use that? Sometimes, there is a value in dividing up what you're giving to the reporter in terms of something that they can publish and attribute to you versus information that you may want to share with the reporter because either you can't or you don't want to be attributed in terms of information you're providing, but you do want to try to guide the story. And it's important to understand what the reporter's understanding is. If you say, look, I want to talk to you off the record, or I'm willing to give you some background on this, but I can't comment publicly about it. The general definition of off the record means it is truly off the record, that it's simply information you're providing to the newspaper reporter that is not supposed to appear in the story in any way, shape, or form. Not only not appear in the story without attributing it to you, but not appear in the story at all. It's really meant to just give the reporter some information that could guide the story but not be included in it. Whereas to give the reporter something on background means that the reporter is able to use it in the story but can't attribute it to you by name. But some reporters don't always understand themselves in a consistent way what those two terms mean. So even though I've had literally hundreds of conversations with the media, either off the record or on background, in any event, I've always taken the time with them to say, okay, so when I say that this is on background, what I understand that to mean is the following. Do you understand it to mean that as well? Or otherwise we need to talk a little bit further about it. Just to make sure that you understand completely and what the reporter believes he or she can do with the information you're providing. Because once it appears in the newspaper, if it's something you wanted to give them truly off the record, and they say in the article, a school district official confirmed with us that the following occurred, you're not getting that back. You can express displeasure, but that's out there now, and you're not getting it back. So it is worth, if you do find it appropriate under whatever circumstances, to talk off the record or talk on background with the media, it's worth that extra step of making sure that you and they both have the same common understanding of what exactly that means and what they're able to do with the information you're providing. And of course, the final caveat of that is, you should at least have a basic level of trust in the reporter that they're actually going to abide by that. There are some reporters who are happy to say that something's on background or off the record, but they don't abide by that standard. They don't abide by that understanding. And again, you can certainly tell them you're disappointed, you're never going to talk to them again, you can never trust them again, but whatever they use, contrary to your understanding, is still out there, in a public report now. So, you got to be very careful about off-the-record, background-type communications, not only in terms of making sure there's a common understanding of what that means, but also to ensure that you have a level of trust that the reporter is actually going to abide by those restrictions. And don't negotiate with a reporter in public, particularly in the context of a press conference. If you do have multiple media there, don't engage in debates, don't engage in negotiations with reporters about what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, when you're going to say something again. It becomes even more important in the larger setting with multiple media to be to the point, to say what you're going to say, to indicate when that is over, and not to take again the bait. You see reporters, particularly when presidents walk from the White House to Marine One, the helicopter, the reporters are constantly shouting out questions. Ronald Reagan always pretended he never heard the questions, except for the ones he wanted to answer, in which case he'd be happy to respond. But it's a typical technique of the media again. They want to get you talking. That's what helps them to generate news and to do their job. But particularly in the public setting, when you have multiple media present, if you're having a press conference or if you're having an interview with multiple media in the superintendent's office, whatever the case may be, don't negotiate, don't debate in public with the media. Say what you're going to say. It's even more important in that context to maintain discipline, stay on message, say what you want to say, do what you want to do, and don't do a thing more than that. When you're on your turf, use your leverage. There's a great benefit, of course, to playing on the home field. If you do invite the media in, use that to your benefit. Use that. You control the setting. You control the environment. If you're going to have the media in the boardroom, perhaps that's right next to the superintendent's office, that provides a very easy way when you're done saying what you want to say to the media to simply say thank you for coming, I appreciate it, and to walk into the superintendent's office, close the door, and that's it, and have somebody escort the media out. So use the turf to your advantage if necessary. Be mindful of the reporter's deadlines. There is a point not only of consideration but strategy in understanding what deadline a reporter is working on. And that particularly becomes important if there is information that you're not aware of or that you need to track down in order to ensure that your message is appropriate and complete. If a reporter calls you in the morning and asks you about something that you simply don't feel confident you know all the necessary facts with regard to, tell the reporter you'll be happy to get back to them, that you need to look at a few things to make sure you're providing them with accurate information. What's your deadline? When do I need to get back to you for you to be able to fold that into the story? And make sure you know that. If they tell you 3 o'clock that day, that's going to be useful. If they tell you, well, I'm not going to write the story till next week, that's also a valuable piece of information. So, at least look as though you're being considerate to the reporter's needs in terms of their deadlines, but also obviously that helps you to figure out what you're able to do to track down information, to refine your message, and to ensure that the SACO that you do deliver to them ultimately is the most effective one. And as I think Carl had made reference to this as well, don't give the public too much data. Stay up there at the conclusion level if you can. Don't try to get down into the weeds if you can avoid it. There are some articles, of course, in the paper that go on for pages and pages, typically front page articles, for instance, in the Buffalo News, that on page 2 or 3 or 4 may have a whole page of graphs and charts and so forth. But those are the exceptions, not the rules. Most of the articles that are generated with regard to individual public school districts are the several column articles that necessarily can't get too deep into the weeds. The more facts and information you give, the more likely something's going to be taken out of context or reported inaccurately. You're not going to get that much space in the article. Use the space you do get in the article to deliver your SACO, and don't get too deep into the weeds in a way that really distracts from that. And don't be afraid to ask for readbacks or do-overs. We talked just a few minutes ago about the possibility of making mistakes. If you do make a mistake, if something came out the way that you weren't entirely happy with, if new information comes up after you already have talked to the media, don't be afraid to call them back and say, look, we just talked a few minutes ago, but as I was thinking about what we were talking about, it occurred to me that it'd also be useful for you to know the following. Try to make it look as though you're trying to be helpful to the reporter, that you want to make the story as accurate as possible, provide as accurate, complete information as possible. So this occurred to me. I really wanted to talk about that. Or, when I responded by saying this, as I thought about it, I just want to make sure you understand that what I meant was, make it look again, not like you're trying to, oh my God, I made a mistake, don't write that, but look as though you're trying to be helpful. But don't be hesitant to do that if you truly feel as though it's a significant material issue and it just simply didn't come out right, or it came out at a time where you didn't have complete information. Carl, I think you're going to take us home.
So the spokesperson, being accessible is of course key. You need to be accessible to these folks. You need to answer the mail. When you're dealing with the public in general, I would suggest, you always answer the mail. You return your calls. Not doing so, especially in a crisis situation, is going to hurt you. Inaccessibility creates a vacuum. And as Jeff suggested before, the press is going to fill the vacuum because they still have that deadline. That incident still happened. Their competition is reporting on it. We have to understand that when we deal with them. Question that Jeff and I are often asked, should your attorney be the spokesperson? My suggestion is, although opinions are divided, but my suggestion is it depends on the circumstances. If you are dealing with an issue that has a lot of legal overtone, yeah, it's appropriate for your attorney to be your spokesperson. It could look like the client has something to hide. That's one view of the world, when you put your mouthpiece out there. But on the other hand, particularly in the public sector, it's often your attorney's role, and part of that role, legitimately, to be your spokesperson. An attorney sometimes is the best person just simply because they know the rules. And it's very easy to get tied up in the rules if you're not intimately familiar with them. And it's a good way to get in trouble if you misspeak and confirm, for example, inadvertently, as Jeff suggested before, an incident that is otherwise covered by the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. The press, of course, prefers a high-ranking official. They prefer to talk to the superintendent. They prefer to talk to the president of the board. And you need to weigh that preference in deciding who the spokesperson is going to be. So there's no one-size-fits-all, again, as Jeff suggested. But these are good things to consider, we would suggest, when determining who the spokesperson ought to be in a crisis. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about not only the venue, but also the kind of reporting that's going on. Are you going to be dealing with the press during a press conference? Are you going to be doing a one-on-one interview with a television reporter? Or are you dealing over the phone with a newspaper reporter, or perhaps even in an office conference at your place, again, with one-on-one with a newspaper reporter? If it's TV or radio, really all you have is between 8 and 15 seconds. That's the soundbite. That's where your SACO is either going to be delivered or not. It's not like Katie Couric and the president. Those interviews rarely occur in a crisis situation. They're really only going to use just a snippet of what you tell them. There are some little rules for television interviews. They're sometimes called the 4 C's. Establishing the rules of the game. You need to try and control this situation. The press is certainly going to report on what you have to say, but they need you at the same time for that report to be substantive. You need to use that leverage, that control. Try and establish the rules. As Jeff said before, when you have a press conference, controlling, who's going to be there, who gets to talk, when does this start, when does it end? All of those logistics, those things are important. But it's just as important in a one-on-one situation. Whether you're dealing with the print media or whether you're dealing with the television and radio folks. Establishing the rules of the game are good. Things like the do-over that Jeff suggested before. Believe it or not, most responsible reporters really want to get it right. They don't necessarily want to make you look bad, especially reporters that are on the education beat and they cover districts all the time. They don't, they know that you guys talk to each other. They know that they develop reputations. They don't necessarily want to have the reputation of the person that's out to burn the district down to the ground. So you can work with these folks in terms of the rules of the game. Obviously, you need to get your SACOs up as far as, to the front of your story as you can, because your SACO could get buried in all the details and may never even get quoted if you don't get it on the record early. The cosmetics, it's important to look good. You're not only there representing yourself, you're representing the district. Sometimes you're representing, not only your students and your employees, but even the public at large. If you have a story that's national in scope, the way you look will reflect on your community. So it's important to look good. Cosmetics are important. Try to avoid distractors. Take that Trump for president pin off the lapel. Anything that's a distractor, because people will focus on that distractor and they won't hear what you're saying. They'll see that unusual thing on your clothing. And they'll say, "Oh man, isn't that neat?" Well, in that moment that it took them to say that, they missed your SACO. 8 to 15 seconds, remember, it's all you have. If it's the print media, as Jeff suggested before, try and write. If you know that reporter is going to call you at 2 o'clock, make an outline of your comments. It's good, incidentally, to have a SACO worksheet. You can make one very easily. Remember earlier on I talked about the elements necessary to develop a SACO? You can take those elements and write them down on a piece of paper and have them available in your desk drawer. And when you're dealing with a crisis, take that piece of paper out and fill in the blanks. It's a great way to develop a SACO. Okay, so now we're talking about sound bites or articles. Whether you're dealing with the print media or you're dealing with the radio and television folks, be available. Establish a presence. And if you can, try and provide some evidence. If it's readily available, it's accurate. You don't always have to stick with that conclusion. Sometimes you're more credible. If the media know, for example, that you conducted a thorough investigation, and the thorough investigation resulted in evidence which led me to the following conclusions, and then you move right into your SACO. Okay? It provides that little credibility piece, that little piece of reliability that reinforces what you're saying, appear obviously to be concerned, compassionate, caring. Whatever you do, don't lose your cool. Sometimes reporters can be really irritating, especially the ones that ask the questions over and over, because they're trying to wheedle more information out of you. That can really be irritating. You've got to be very, very careful to maintain that professional demeanor during the interview. Something that lawyers have to heed. We think it's a pretty good rule. That's why we're going to talk just a moment about it. We ethically are precluded from giving false information of any kind. You just can't do it. It's a way to become disbarred in our business. It's not a bad rule for anyone speaking with the press to bear in mind. Okay, you've had your crisis. You've gotten through the first day. What's next? You have to prepare for day 2. You have a bus accident. Child is seriously injured. The next day, the child takes a turn for the worst. The press is going to be back. You need to be ready for that in advance. You need to plan for day 2, not after day 1 is over and you breathe the big sigh of relief. It's not necessarily over in terms of your responsibility to respond concerning the incident. The media may become less interested as time goes on. That's probably a good thing. I mean, there is a news cycle, and there'll be tomorrow's headline that may overshadow your crisis. But nonetheless, if you respond with concern, you turn that crisis into an opportunity, as Jeff also suggested, that can be a very good thing for you and also for the school district. As Jeff also suggested, there are some laws overlaying a lot of what we do in the public sector. We're the only sector, the only business component where the Constitution actually has to be considered with respect to what we do. So there are constitutional and all kinds of legal restrictions that can get in the way of perhaps delivering the message that we might want to deliver but can't because of these constrictions. You've got the open meetings law, things that happen in executive session. By and large, those things cannot be talked about. The Freedom of Information law. There are only certain things that we are able to release, and there are certain things that we cannot deny release to. You've got to bear those distinctions in mind when dealing with the press. I mentioned FERPA before, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Very restrictive with respect to what we can say concerning students. There are other statutes. As I like to say, the education law really is vast. It's a lot more than the 9 volumes in the Kinney statutes. There are a lot of laws that impact us. One is the Civil Practice Law and Rules, the CPLR. The reason I list that particularly is it deals with the attorney-client privilege. And that privilege is way more sacrosanct, I would suggest, than even the one under the Open Meetings Law dealing with executive session. Because that privilege is an absolute privilege. It's doctor, patient, priest, penitent, attorney-client. Those are the 3 big ones. The social media is the new public record. Jeff suggested very aptly before that we now have to be prepared for that very compressed news cycle that happens by reason of the social media. You just can't operate without a good knowledge of that anymore. And it's not a bad idea when something like this is breaking to have one of your folks monitor what's being said about it in social media, because that often will be the fodder for that media question that you will get. So it's good to be aware of what other folks are saying. A couple conclusions. Probably my favorite Winston Churchill quote, there's nothing more exhilarating than being shot at without success, and having had that happen to me personally. I can certainly tell you that it's very true. It's also true that after a successful dealing with the media in a crisis situation, that same feeling of exhilaration can happen. And Jefferson, my hope is that as a result of what we've had to say today, you all, if you ever have to confront a crisis, will also share in that exhilaration after it's over. If there are any questions, I see we have a few minutes. Jeff and I would be happy to entertain them.
You know, Carol, one point that might be useful just to expand upon is you mentioned FOIL. And I know there are some municipalities that require the media, whenever they ask for information, to file a FOIL request. Some don't do that. And you can do either one of those two. I think the one benefit of not requiring the media to file a FOIL is that once they file a FOIL, you're subject to the FOIL rules, which means you have to share stuff that is responsive to the request, unless it's particularly under FOIL protected from disclosure. Whereas if they simply ask you about something or ask you for something and you provide it outside of FOIL, you're not held to that same standard. You're not held to provide them necessarily everything within the scope of their request. You can simply say, I know you would ask for certain information. Here's the information I'd like to give you. Let me know if you have any questions, or let's talk about it, let's review it. So there can be a value in working with the media outside of FOIL if you wish. I would suggest you need to be consistent about that and not play favorites. And sometimes, of course, if the news cycle is rapidly unfolding before you, they're practically speaking not going to have time to file a FOIL request and go through your normal FOIL procedure to get necessary information. You may decide to be affirmative about it and just provide them out of necessity certain information if it's helpful, if you believe it's helpful, and if it's supportive of your SACO ultimately on the story that's being written. But that is one issue under FOIL that I've seen municipalities struggle with. I agree, and there's an additional benefit to doing that. How often have you read in the paper that a story that begins with the reporters reciting that they had to file a FOIL request in order to get the information? How does that make the public entity look when that information otherwise would have been releasable anyways? Why make them jump through that extra hurdle if you don't have to? Yes, sir.
Likewise, one of the most awkward things we have to comment on the staff misconduct. And then again, reading the paper that, because it's a personnel matter, we're not allowed to comment on that. It's right aligned with no comment. Is there a better way to phrase something along those lines?
Oh, sure. Jeff paraphrased it very well, I thought, with respect to a student incident, but it would apply to employees as well. We take employee misconduct in our district very seriously. And if there is in fact an incident with respect to misconduct such as the one you're describing to me, let me tell you what the district would do about it. We'd have an investigation. We do this, we do that. We would grant the employee due process of law, which we're required to do. That's very important in a democratic society. But, it's that sort of thing that you can utilize, but at the same time not even acknowledging that the incident necessarily took place.
I mean, there may be circumstances where there's so much detail known, or where the misconduct is so public or so serious that you do decide to share certain information that may be particular to the employee and to the incident. A couple things to think about in that regard, at least a couple things to think about in that regard, is the incident may lead to disciplinary proceedings during which whatever public statements you do make can and would be held against you. And there also is a law enforcement component as well. If you're dealing with something having to do with employee misconduct that also has involved law enforcement authorities, it's very important to coordinate appropriately along the way. They're not going to be subject to the same types of considerations that you are in terms of what you may or may not say and what details you may or may not share. They oftentimes feel as though they have a freer hand to say whatever they want to say about the incident. So it could be useful, and almost always is useful, to coordinate with them to make sure at least you know what the other is doing, and to make sure that neither is working at cross purposes with the other.
Yes, on the flip side, often the district attorney is not going to want you to comment with respect to that kind of a matter. We had an unusual situation here not too long ago in Western New York involving a cybersecurity breach where the student was the hacker. And I was in constant contact with the district attorney because there was a criminal prosecution going on at the same time. And we yet had the responsibility to let our folks know that their data had not been compromised. We coordinated that message very carefully. Right?
Like involving situations maybe with a personnel or a student issue where you're in a situation where the other side, the employer, the student, maybe going to the media and leaking enormous amounts of information to kind of get their story out, and in the process maybe even disclosing from the school's perspective what might be confidential information. Can there be any benefit, obviously, in being confronted with that? Obviously, you cannot rebut what they're giving the media because you have the restrictions that they don't have.
It depends whose right it is.
Right.
If it's the employee's right that otherwise would be protected, there's something to be said to responding when the employee waives that right by going on the record.
As I was wondering, do you think it could be a good strategy to go to the reporter and say, hey, I'd love to tell you more, but I'm restricted by federal law. If you go back to the parents or to the person and they consent to waiving their confidentiality, I can discuss this matter further.
Absolutely. In fact, I've used that line. Yes, sir.
Can you restrict other people in your organization to talk to the media?
It depends on whether what they have to say is within the scope of their employment or whether they are commenting on a matter that otherwise would be of public concern. There's a First Amendment question that you're touching on here. And that's a case by case. There's no one size fits all. I mean, there are some times where your employees are going to have the perfect constitutional right to talk. And there are other times when there is information that really is private, to the school. And in that circumstance, absolutely, you can restrict folks from doing that. Yes?
And it varies according to level of position within the district. The higher up you are hierarchically, the less right you have to talk about even matters of public concern that other rank and file employees, for instance, could freely comment on. So it depends on facts, it depends upon position in the district, the subject at issue, and the types of comments being made.
That's one time when working with your attorney is pretty important. But that's a great question, and it's something that is confronted frequently. But
They really want to talk with a couple of people in the organization.
Oh, sure. And you can't necessarily, and you may not necessarily want to restrict that, particularly where you've had good communication with your staff already, and the message is consistent. It actually lends credibility to what you have to say if the staff folks give the same information that you did. So again, it's a very circumstance-driven situation. Well, it looks like we're not only at the end of the hour, but we've kind of run out of questions, I think. So with that, thank you very, very much for your kind attention, and hopefully you won't be in this kind of situation that I normally like to end presentations with. That's the old saw that if at first you don't succeed, you'll get a lot of advice. Thanks for
Jeff, Carl, thank you again. Once again, we're reminded of how important it is to have this information before something happens, and I'm sure that should the unfortunate thing happen to any one of us, those of us who are here will benefit from that. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.